The gates of Whitmore Castle stood wide open when Duke Alaric rode through them, and that alone told him something was wrong. Gates were never left open. Not during the day, not during the night, not even when the whole household was awake and working. He pulled his horse to a stop in the courtyard and looked around. No stable boy ran out to take the reins. No guard called out a greeting from the wall. The only sound was the wind moving through the empty yard, lifting bits of dry leaves and pushing them across the stones. He had been away for 3 months. 3 months of cold camps, long rides, and careful talks meant to end a dispute over land that bordered his family's territory. He had thought of nothing but this moment, the whole way home, the moment he would walk through the doors and see his wife, Duchess Seraphine, waiting for him with her calm eyes and her quiet smile. He had imagined the warmth of the fire in the main hall, the smell of bread from the kitchen, the sound of her voice asking him about his journey. Instead, there was silence, a silence so complete that it pressed against his ears. Alaric dismounted slowly, his boots landing on stone that seemed colder than he remembered. He walked toward the front doors, which were also open, swinging slightly with the wind. He stepped inside and called out, "Seraphine?" No answer came. His voice bounced off the walls and returned to him, empty. He walked through the main hall, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. The long table where the family took its meals had no cloth on it. The chairs were pushed in, unused, dust gathering on their backs. The fire, which should have been burning even in the warmer months for the comfort of the household, was cold and gray, nothing but ash in the pit. "Barnaby," he called, thinking of the old steward who had served his family for decades. "Barnaby, where is everyone?" Still nothing. He moved faster now, his calm breaking apart piece by piece. He checked the sitting room, where Seraphine liked to read in the afternoons. Her favorite chair sat by the window, but the books that usually covered the small table beside it were gone. He checked the music room, where she sometimes played the harp in the evenings. The harp itself was still there, but it looked as if no one had touched it in weeks. A thin layer of dust covered its strings. Alaric's heart began to beat faster. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his hand trailing along the railing, feeling nothing but cold stone under his palm. He reached the long hallway that led to the family's private rooms, and here, the strangeness grew even stronger. Portraits that had hung on these walls since before he was born were missing. He could see the pale outlines on the wallpaper where they used to be, ghostly squares marking where his ancestors once looked down on anyone who passed. He pushed open the door to the bedchamber he shared with his wife, half expecting to find her there, perhaps ill, perhaps simply resting, but the room was empty. Her side of the bed was made, untouched, as if no one had slept there in a long time. He walked to the wardrobe and opened it. Half of her dresses were gone. Not all of them, but enough that anyone who knew her would notice immediately. Her favorite blue traveling cloak was missing. So was the small wooden box where she kept her mother's jewelry. He stood there for a long moment, his mind racing through explanations, each one worse than the last. Had there been an attack while he was away? Had she been taken? But an attack would have left signs of a struggle, and there were none. Everything here looked deliberate, careful, planned. Someone had packed these things and left with purpose, not in fear. He left the bedchamber and continued down the hallway, checking room after room, finding the same emptiness everywhere. The nursery, unused for years but always kept clean out of old habit, was untouched by dust, meaning someone had continued to care for it even recently. The library, usually full of servants dusting shelves and organizing scrolls, was silent and cold. It was in the small chapel at the end of the east wing that he finally found a sign of life. An old man sat on one of the wooden benches, his head bowed, his hands folded in his lap. Alaric recognized him at once. Barnaby, the steward who had worked for the Whitmore family since before Alaric was even old enough to walk. "Barnaby," Alaric said, relief and fear mixing together in his voice. "Barnaby, thank goodness. Where is everyone? Where is my wife?" The old man lifted his head slowly. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying, or perhaps simply not sleeping well for a long time. He looked at Alaric, and for a moment he said nothing at all. "My lord," Barnaby finally said, his voice shaking slightly, "you've come home." "Of course I've come home," Alaric said, kneeling in front of the old steward. "Barnaby, tell me what has happened here. Where is the staff? Where is my wife?" Barnaby looked away, unable to meet the Duke's eyes. The Duchess, he began, then stopped, as if the words were too heavy to lift. What about her? Alaric's voice grew sharper now, edged with fear. Barnaby, please. She dismissed us, Barnaby said quietly. All of us. Weeks ago. She called each servant to her privately, one by one, and she gave each of them a generous sum of money, more than they were owed, and she asked them to leave the castle. She told them not to worry, that everything would be explained in time, but that they should go and find new positions, or return to their families, and that she was sorry for the trouble. Alaric stared at him, unable to process the words. She dismissed the entire staff? Why would she do such a thing? I do not know, my lord, Barnaby said. She did not explain her reasons to any of us. She only asked us to trust her. And you? Why are you still here? Barnaby's hands trembled slightly in his lap. She asked me to stay behind. She said someone needed to be here when you returned, someone who could explain what little could be explained, and who could show you where she had left something for you. Alaric's heart nearly stopped. Left something for me? What do you mean? A letter, my lord, Barnaby said. She wrote you a letter before she left. She sealed it with her own ring, and she made me promise that no one but you would open it. She said it explained everything, or as much as could be explained in words. Where is she now? Alaric demanded, standing quickly. Where did she go? I do not know, my lord. She left on horseback. 3 weeks passed, taking only a small trunk with her. She did not tell me her destination. She only said that the letter would explain what needed to be explained, and that I should trust her judgment, as I always had. Alaric felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. 3 weeks. His wife had been gone for 3 weeks, and he had been riding home the entire time, imagining a warm reunion, never once suspecting that the woman he loved had quietly dismantled their entire household and disappeared into the countryside. Where is the letter? He asked, his voice now barely above a whisper. In your bedchamber, my lord. On your pillow. I did not touch it. I have looked at it every day since she left, wondering what it said, wondering if I should have insisted on more answers before she rode away. But she asked for my trust, and I gave it to her, as I have given it to your family my whole life. Alaric turned without another word, and ran back through the halls, his boots echoing against the stone, his mind spinning through every possible reason his wife might have for such an act. He thought of arguments they'd had, though there had been few, and none serious. He thought of illness, though she had seemed well before he left. He thought, with a cold twist in his stomach, of other men, though he dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it came, ashamed of himself for even considering it. Seraphine was not a woman who acted out of anger or foolishness. Whatever she had done it with reason, with care, with the same thoughtful nature she brought to everything in her life. He reached the bedchamber and stopped in the doorway, his chest heaving from the run. There, on the pillow where his wife used to rest her head each night, sat a folded piece of parchment, sealed with a small circle of dark red wax. He could see the shape pressed into the wax, the mark of her family's ring, a delicate pattern of vines circling a single star. He crossed the room slowly, as if approaching something fragile, something that might break or disappear if he moved too quickly. He picked up the letter with both hands and looked at it for a long moment before turning it over. On the front, in her familiar, elegant handwriting, were the words that made his throat tighten. To my husband, when he finally comes home. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He thought of all the mornings they had shared in this room, all the quiet conversations, all the small moments that had built a life together over the past several years. He thought of the day he had married her, the way she had looked at him, as if he were the only person in the world worth looking at. He thought of her laugh, quiet and warm, and the way she hummed old songs when she thought no one was listening. He broke the seal. The wax cracked apart easily, falling in small red pieces onto the blanket beneath him. He unfolded the parchment carefully, smoothing it out on his knee, and he began to read. My dearest Alaric, if you are reading this, then you have come home, and I am not there to greet you, and I know that this will frighten you more than almost anything else in the world could. I am sorry for that. I have thought of little else these past weeks, besides the moment you would walk through our doors and find the castle empty, and I have imagined your fear, and it has caused me great pain to know that I am the cause of it. Please believe me when I say that I did not make this choice lightly, and that everything I have done, I have done out of love for you, even if it does not feel that way in this moment." Alaric stopped reading for a moment, his eyes stinging. He forced himself to continue. "Do you remember the day we married? I remember every detail of it. I remember the way the light came through the chapel windows, gold and soft, falling across your shoulders as you waited for me at the front. I remember thinking that I had never seen anyone look so nervous and so happy at the same time. I remember the little joke you made afterward, about how you had nearly forgotten your own vows because you could not stop looking at me, and how we laughed about it together for years afterward. Whenever either of us forgot a small thing, we would blame it on love making us foolish. I have held on to memories like this every day since I left, because I needed something to remind me why I was doing what I was doing, and why I still love you, even now, even as I write this, not knowing exactly how you will feel when you finish reading these words. Alaric, there is something I must tell you, something I discovered while you were away, something that has changed the way I understand our marriage, our families, and the history between them. I did not go looking for this knowledge. It found me, quite by accident, in a place I never expected." His hands tightened around the parchment. He read on, his heart pounding with every line, sensing that whatever came next would change everything he understood about his life. "It began on an ordinary afternoon, only a few days after you left for the border talks. I was restless, as I often am when you are away, and I decided to spend some time in the old archive room, the one at the top of the North Tower, where your family has kept records and letters for generations. I had gone there before, mostly out of curiosity, looking through old documents about the history of Whitmore land, the treaties your ancestors signed, the maps of the estate as it grew over the centuries. I found it peaceful there, surrounded by the quiet weight of history. But this time, tucked behind a shelf of ledgers, I found a small wooden box I had never noticed before. It was old, its lock rusted shut, and it took me the better part of an hour to open it with an old key I found nearby. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon, written in a hand I did not recognize at first. I want you to know, Alaric, that I almost did not read them. Something in me hesitated, some instinct telling me that whatever was inside that box had been hidden for a reason, and that perhaps it should remain hidden. But curiosity, and perhaps some quieter sense that I needed to know, pushed me forward, and I began to read. The letters were written by your father, many years before either of us was born, and as I read them, my dear husband, I felt the ground shift beneath me, much as I imagine you feel now, reading my words on this page. Alaric set the letter down for a moment, his breath shallow. He had never known his father well. The old duke had passed when Alaric was still young, leaving behind a reputation of quiet strength and fair judgment, a man remembered fondly by the people of the estate. He picked the letter back up, his hands unsteady, and continued reading, bracing himself for whatever truth waited in the lines ahead. I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, and I am sorry that I could not find a gentler way to say it, but I believe you deserve honesty, always, even when it is difficult, and so I will not soften what I found. The letters revealed that your father, many years ago, was involved in a scheme that led to the ruin of another family, a family whose name you may not recognize now, because their title and land were taken from them so completely that even their history was nearly erased. That family, Alaric, was mine. The room seemed to grow smaller around him. Alaric read the sentence again, and then a third time, as if repetition might change its meaning. His father, her family, ruin. I did not know this before I opened that box. I had always been told, as a child, that my family lost our land and title through misfortune, through bad harvests, and worse decisions made by an ancestor long forgotten. I never suspected that the truth was so much darker, or that it involved the very family I would one day marry into. The letters describe a plan, carried out quietly over several years, using false claims and clever manipulation of old laws, to strip my family of everything we once held. I will not go into every detail here, because some of it is too painful to write, and because I believe you should see the letters yourself, which I have left in the same box where I found them, so that you may judge the truth of my words with your own eyes. I do not write this to accuse you, Alaric. You were an infant when these events took place. You had no part in what your father did, and I do not believe, even now, that you would have approved of such actions had you known of them. But I could not simply set this discovery aside and pretend I had never learned it. I needed time to understand what it meant for us, for our marriage, for the life we have built together. That is why I have gone away for a time. Not because I no longer love you, and not because I blame you for the sins of your father, but because I needed distance and quiet to decide, honestly and carefully, whether I could carry this knowledge and still stand beside you as your wife, without it becoming a shadow between us, without it poisoning something that has otherwise brought me such happiness. Alaric lowered the letter and stared at the wall for a long moment, his mind a storm of confusion, grief, and something that felt strangely like guilt, though he had done nothing himself. He thought of his father, a man he barely remembered beyond a few fond images from early childhood, a warm hand on his shoulder, a deep laugh at the dinner table. He had never imagined that man capable of the kind of calculated cruelty Seraphine described. He forced himself to keep reading, though every line felt heavier than the last. I have gone to my family's old estate, the one that has stood empty and forgotten for many years, the one I visited only once as a small child, before we lost it entirely. I do not know exactly what I hope to find there, perhaps nothing but old stone and overgrown gardens, but I feel that I must go, that I must stand in the place where my family once lived, before I can decide what to do with what I now know. I do not ask you to follow me, Alaric, though I suspect you will want to, because I know your heart, and I know that you will not simply wait patiently for my return without seeking answers of your own. If you do come, know that I will not turn you away. I only ask that you first look at the letters in the North Tower, so that you understand fully what I have learned, and so that we may speak to each other as equals, both aware of the same truth, rather than one of us carrying a secret the other does not yet understand. I love you, Alaric. That has not changed, and I do not believe it ever will. But love, I have come to understand these past weeks, is not simply a feeling we carry. It is also a choice we make, again and again, even when the truth is difficult, even when the path forward is unclear. I am trying to make that choice honestly, and I hope, when the time comes, that you will understand why I needed to walk this path alone for a while, before we can walk it together again. With all my heart, now and always, Seraphine Alaric sat motionless on the edge of the bed for a long time after he finished reading, the letter resting loosely in his hands, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The castle around him remained silent, but the silence felt different now, heavier, filled with the weight of everything he had just learned. Somewhere above him, in the North Tower, a box of old letters waited to reveal the sins of a father he thought he had known. Somewhere far beyond the castle walls, his wife stood among the ruins of a family destroyed by his own bloodline, trying to decide if their love could survive the truth. He folded the letter carefully, the way one might fold something precious, and pressed it against his chest for a moment, as if he could somehow feel her presence through the paper itself. Then he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and walked toward the door. He knew what he had to do next. He had to climb the stairs to the North Tower, and he had to face whatever truth waited for him there, no matter how much it might change the way he saw his own family, his own history, and the man he had always believed his father to be. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the empty castle, as if the very stones knew that something important was about to be uncovered, something that had been buried and hidden for far too long, and that could no longer stay in the dark. The stairs to the North Tower were narrow and worn. Each stone step dipped slightly in the middle, from centuries of footsteps that came before his own. Alaric climbed them quickly, one hand pressed against the cold wall for balance, his heart still pounding from what he had just read. He had climbed these stairs many times as a boy, chasing his cousins in games of hide-and-seek, laughing without a single thought for what secrets might be waiting in the room above. Now every step felt like it carried him further from the innocent memories of his childhood, and closer to a truth he was not sure he wanted to know. He reached the top of the tower and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The archive room greeted him with its familiar smell, old paper and dust, and the faint trace of candle wax that never seemed to fade no matter how many years passed. Shelves lined every wall, packed with ledgers, maps, and bound records stretching back further than Alaric could count. Sunlight came through a single round window, casting a pale circle of light across the wooden floor. He remembered Seraphine's words from the letter and moved toward the far shelf, running his fingers along the spines of old books until he found the gap she had described. Behind a row of ledgers, tucked into shadow, sat the small wooden box, its lid slightly open, just as she had left it. His breath caught in his throat. He reached out and lifted the lid the rest of the way. Inside were the letters, still tied together with the same faded ribbon Seraphine had mentioned. He lifted the bundle carefully, feeling the brittle edges of old parchment beneath his fingers, and carried it to the small table beneath the round window. He sat down, untied the ribbon with trembling hands, and began to read. The first letter was dated more than 30 years earlier, written in a firm, confident hand that Alaric recognized immediately as his father's. He had seen that handwriting before, on old documents, on a few personal notes that had survived in the family study. Seeing it now, knowing what it might contain, made his stomach tighten painfully. The letter was addressed to a man named Edmund Hartley, a name Alaric did not recognize, though something about it felt distantly familiar, as if he had heard it once, long ago, in a conversation he had not thought important enough to remember. "My dear Hartley," the letter began, "I trust the arrangements we discussed are proceeding as planned. The Ashfield family continues to believe their claim to the eastern fields remains secure, unaware that the documents filed last spring have already begun to shift the balance in our favor. Your assistance in locating the original boundary records, and in ensuring certain pages were misplaced before they could be properly reviewed by the court, has been invaluable. I do not forget such loyalty, and you will find your reward reflects that." Alaric read the words twice, his mind struggling to accept what they so plainly described. His father had deliberately hidden documents, manipulated records, all to seize land that belonged to another family, the Ashfield family. He turned the name over in his mind, and slowly, a memory stirred, faint and distant, of an old story he had heard as a child about a family that once held significant land near the eastern border, a family that had fallen into ruin generations ago through circumstances no one ever fully explained. He set the first letter aside and reached for the next, his hands steadier now, driven by a grim determination to understand the full truth rather than turn away from it. The second letter continued the same theme, describing further steps taken to weaken the Ashfield family's position. It mentioned false rumors spread among local merchants, suggesting the Ashfields could not be trusted to honor their debts, causing several important business relationships to collapse. It mentioned a judge who had been persuaded, through means the letter did not specify, but strongly implied were less than honest, to rule against the Ashfields in a dispute that should have favored them clearly, under any fair reading of the law. Alaric felt sick reading it, not because the words were harsh in their language, but because of the calm, almost businesslike tone his father used to describe the systematic downfall of another family. There was no hesitation in the writing, no doubt, no moment of conscience. It read like a man discussing the harvest, or the repair of a roof, rather than the deliberate ruin of people who had done nothing to deserve it. He continued through the letters, each one adding another piece to a picture that grew darker with every page. By the 8th letter, the full scope of what had happened became clear. Over the course of nearly 5 years, Alaric's father had systematically stripped the Ashfield family of their land, their wealth, and eventually their title, using a combination of legal manipulation, false accusations, and quiet bribery. The final letter in the bundle, dated shortly after the last of the Ashfield land had been transferred into Whitmore hands, contained a single line that Alaric would never forget. "It is finished," the letter read. "The Ashfield name will fade from memory within a generation, and none will remember what was lost, save perhaps the family themselves, who will carry the weight alone." Alaric set the letter down and pressed both hands against his face, breathing slowly, trying to steady the storm of feelings rising within him. Anger, first, sharp and immediate, directed at a man who could no longer answer for his actions. Then sorrow, for the family that had suffered so greatly, a family that had become his own wife's family, though she had grown up never knowing the true cause of her ancestors' downfall. And beneath it all, a quiet, creeping unease, though he knew rationally that he bore no responsibility for events that occurred before his birth. Still, he had inherited the land his father had taken. He had inherited the title built partly upon another family's ruin. He had married into that same family without either of them knowing the connection between their two houses ran so deep. He sat in the tower for a long while, the letters spread across the table in front of him, sunlight slowly shifting across the floor as the afternoon wore on. He thought of Seraphine, discovering this same truth weeks earlier, alone, with no one to comfort her, no one to share the weight of such a discovery. He thought of how frightened and betrayed she must have felt, learning that the man she loved carried, through no fault of his own, the legacy of the very family that destroyed her own. He understood now, more fully, why she had needed to leave. It was not an act of anger or rejection. It was an act of careful, painful honesty. A woman trying to determine whether she could reconcile her love for her husband with the terrible history now tangled between their families. He respected her for it, even as it broke his heart to imagine her carrying such a burden alone. Alaric gathered the letters carefully, tying the ribbon back around them, and placed them back into the wooden box. He would need them again, he knew, perhaps to show others, perhaps simply to remind himself of the truth he now carried. He stood, his legs stiff from sitting so long, and walked slowly back toward the tower door, his mind already turning toward what he needed to do next. He needed to find Seraphine. He needed to see her, to speak with her, to let her know that he had read the letters, that he understood, and that whatever came next, he wanted to face it beside her rather than apart from her. But he did not know exactly where she had gone. Her letter had mentioned her family's old estate, the one abandoned and forgotten for years, but she had not given its precise location, perhaps assuming he would know, or perhaps simply too overwhelmed with feeling when she wrote it. He descended the tower stairs quickly, his mind already working through who might know the answer. Barnaby, perhaps, though the old steward had already said he did not know Seraphine's destination. Perhaps the family records themselves would hold a clue, an old map or document describing where the Ashfield estate had once stood. He found Barnaby still in the small chapel, exactly where he had left him, though the old man now stood near the window, looking out at the empty courtyard with a troubled expression. "My lord," Barnaby said, turning as Alaric entered, "did you find what you needed in the tower?" "I found more than I wanted to know," Alaric admitted, his voice heavy. "Barnaby, did my father ever speak to you of a family named Ashfield?" The old steward's face changed immediately, a flicker of recognition and discomfort passing across his features. "Ashfield," he repeated slowly. "Yes, my lord. I remember the name, though it has been many years since I heard it spoken aloud. Your father did not discuss them often, and when he did, it was always in passing, as if the subject made him uneasy. Do you know where their old estate might be found? The land they once held before it passed to our family?" Barnaby considered the question for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "I believe I recall hearing, many years ago, that the Ashfield estate lay somewhere to the east, near the old forest that borders the river. I never visited it myself, and I could not say with certainty whether any of the original buildings still stand. It has been abandoned for so long, my lord, that most people have likely forgotten it ever existed." "That must be where she has gone," Alaric said, more to himself than to Barnaby. "She said in her letter that she traveled to her family's old estate, the one that has stood empty for years. It must be the same place. Will you go after her, my lord?" Alaric looked at the old steward, and for the first time since he had ridden through the castle gates that morning, a small measure of resolve steadied his voice. "Yes, Barnaby, I will go after her. But first I must prepare properly, and I must think carefully about what I will say to her when I find her. This is not a simple matter of riding out and demanding her return. She has learned something terrible about my family, about my father, and she deserves patience and understanding, not haste." Barnaby nodded slowly. "She is a woman of great heart, my lord, and great courage as well, to leave everything she knew, rather than simply pretend she had learned nothing. I have served this family many years, and I have never seen the Duchess act without careful thought. Whatever she decides, I believe she will decide it honestly." "I know," Alaric said quietly. "That is exactly what troubles me most. If she decides, after all this thought, that she cannot remain my wife, I do not know how I will bear it." The old steward said nothing for a moment, allowing the weight of Alaric's words to settle in the quiet chapel. Then he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "My lord, if I may offer an old man's view, I do not believe the Duchess left because she wished to end your marriage. I believe she left because she wished to save it, in the only way she knew how, by facing the truth fully, before allowing it to sit unspoken between you. A woman who wished only to leave would not have written you such a letter, nor would she have asked me to remain behind to guide you toward understanding. She wants you to follow her, my lord. She wants you to come and speak with her as an equal, both of you carrying the same knowledge, the same truth. That is not the action of someone seeking to end a marriage. That is the action of someone seeking to save one, even at great personal cost. Alaric felt a small measure of comfort in the old man's words, though the worry did not entirely leave him. He thanked Barnaby and asked him to remain at the castle a while longer, to help him gather what few provisions remained, and to assist in preparing for the journey ahead. He then returned to the family study, a room he had not yet visited since arriving home, hoping to find any additional records or maps that might help him locate the Ashfield estate with greater certainty. The study was, like the rest of the castle, covered in a fine layer of dust, though less so than other rooms, suggesting Seraphine herself had spent time here before her departure, perhaps searching for the very information Alaric now sought. He moved to the shelves that held the estate's oldest maps, unrolling several, before finding one that showed the eastern territories in detail, including the forest and river Barnaby had mentioned. There, marked in faded ink near the river's bend, was a small symbol he recognized as an old estate marker, along with a name written in careful, antique script. Ashfield Manor. His heart quickened at the sight of it. This was the place. This was where Seraphine had gone, and where he now intended to follow. He rolled the map carefully and tucked it beneath his arm, his mind already turning toward the practical matters of the journey ahead. He would need a fresh horse, since his current mount was tired from the long ride home. He would need provisions for several days, since he was not entirely certain how far the journey would take him, or how long he might need to stay once he arrived. And he would need, more than anything else, the right words, words that could bridge the terrible history between their two families, and reaffirm the love that had brought them together in the first place. As the afternoon light began to fade into evening, Alaric stood in the empty courtyard of his family's castle, looking east toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. Somewhere beyond those hills, past the forest and the river, his wife waited among the ruins of a family destroyed by his own bloodline, trying to decide whether love could survive the weight of such a difficult truth. He knew what he had to do. He would rest tonight, gather his strength and his thoughts, and at first light, he would ride east, toward Ashfield Manor, toward the woman he loved, and toward whatever answer awaited him there, whether it brought him comfort or heartbreak. He could not know which it would be, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that he had to find out, and that he had to face it, whatever it turned out to be, with honesty and courage equal to the honesty and courage his wife had shown in leaving that letter behind. Alaric left before the sun had fully risen, the sky still streaked with gray and pale orange, the air cold enough to bite at his hands as he gripped the reins of his freshest horse. Barnaby stood at the gate to see him off, a small bundle of food and supplies tied behind the saddle, along with the rolled map and, carefully wrapped in cloth, the bundle of old letters he intended to bring with him. He did not know yet whether he would show them to Seraphine or simply keep them close, as proof that he had done what she asked, that he had faced the truth fully before coming to find her. "Ride safely, my lord," Barnaby called as Alaric turned his horse toward the eastern road, "and bring her home." Alaric nodded once, unable to trust his voice, and rode out through the gates he had entered only a day before, this time leaving behind an empty castle that felt less like a home and more like a place waiting to be filled again with the life it had lost. The road east was long and mostly empty, winding through fields that had just begun to turn gold with the early signs of harvest season. Alaric rode hard through the morning, stopping only briefly to water his horse at a small stream that crossed the path, his mind constantly returning to the letters he had read, to Seraphine's words, to the terrible history now tangled between their two families. He tried to imagine what he would say to her when he finally found her, but every version of the conversation he rehearsed in his mind felt inadequate, too small for the weight of what needed to be said. By midday, he reached a small village he recognized from old journeys, a cluster of stone cottages, and a modest inn where travelers often stopped to rest before continuing further east. He decided to pause here briefly, both to rest his horse and to ask if anyone had seen a woman traveling alone, matching Seraphine's description, passing through in recent weeks. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man with a graying beard, recognized Alaric immediately and greeted him with the respect due his title, though his expression shifted to curiosity when Alaric asked his question. "A woman traveling alone, you say? On horseback, with a small trunk?" The innkeeper scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Yes, my lord. I believe I remember such a traveler. She passed through here perhaps 3 weeks past, though she did not stay long. She asked only for directions toward the old forest road, the one that leads toward the river crossing. I remember thinking it strange, since few travelers use that road anymore. It leads mostly to abandoned land, forgotten by most everyone, except the occasional hunter or wandering trader. Did she seem well? Alaric asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. Did she seem frightened, or in any distress? The innkeeper considered the question carefully before answering. She seemed determined, my lord, if I may say so. Quiet, thoughtful, perhaps a bit tired from her journey, but not frightened. She spoke calmly, thanked me for the directions, and continued on her way without further delay. Alaric felt a small measure of relief at these words, though his worry did not fully disappear. He thanked the innkeeper, purchased a few additional provisions for the remainder of his journey, and continued east once the horse had rested sufficiently. The road grew narrower and rougher as the afternoon wore on, the fields giving way gradually to denser woodland, the old forest Barnaby and the innkeeper had both mentioned. Alaric found himself watching the shadows between the trees carefully, though he was not entirely certain what he expected to find there. The forest felt old in a way that was difficult to describe, ancient trees rising high overhead, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the afternoon light, leaving the road beneath cool and dim even in the middle of the day. As he rode deeper into the forest, his thoughts drifted back to his father, a man he remembered mostly through fragments, brief images from childhood that had, until now, always felt warm and comforting. He remembered sitting on his father's shoulders as a young boy, watching a parade of visiting nobles pass through the castle courtyard. He remembered his father teaching him to ride a horse for the first time, patient and encouraging, even when Alaric fell more than once. He remembered his father's voice, deep and steady, reading old stories aloud by the fire on winter evenings. None of those memories matched the man described in the letters he now carried. That man had been calculating, willing to destroy an entire family through deception and quiet cruelty, all for the sake of land and wealth that the Whitmore family, by any honest measure, had not needed. Alaric found himself wondering how a single person could contain both versions, the loving father he remembered, and the ruthless schemer revealed in those old pages. Perhaps, he thought, people were rarely only one thing. Perhaps his father had genuinely loved his family, while also being capable of terrible actions toward others, the two things existing side by side, without either one erasing the other. It was not a comforting thought, but it felt honest, and honesty, he realized, was exactly what this entire situation demanded of him now. The forest road eventually led him to the edge of a wide river, exactly as the map had described, its water moving slowly and calmly beneath the afternoon sun that had finally broken through the trees again. A narrow wooden bridge crossed the water, old but apparently still sturdy, and beyond it, Alaric could see the road continuing toward a low hill in the distance, atop which stood the silhouette of old buildings, their shapes softened by distance and the golden light of late afternoon. Ashfield Manor. His heart quickened at the sight of it. He urged his horse across the bridge, the old wood creaking softly beneath the animal's weight, and continued up the winding path toward the hill. As he drew closer, he could see more clearly the state of the old estate. Much of it had fallen into disrepair, the roof of what must have once been an impressive main hall, now partially collapsed, ivy climbing thick and wild across the outer walls, windows broken, or entirely missing their glass. It was a sad sight, a testament to years of abandonment and neglect, and Alaric felt a fresh wave of guilt looking upon it, knowing now the true reason such a grand estate had been left to ruin. But as he approached the main courtyard, he noticed something that gave him hope. A section of the garden nearest the main entrance appeared to have been recently tended. Weeds had been cleared from a small patch of earth, and a few hardy flowers, the kind that could survive with minimal care, had been planted in careful rows. Someone had been here, working with patient hands, trying to bring some small measure of life back to this forgotten place. He dismounted near the entrance, and tied his horse to a post that, despite the general decay around it, appeared to have been recently repaired, the wood fresh and unweathered compared to the rest of the structure. He walked toward the main doors, his heart pounding with anticipation and no small amount of fear, uncertain what reception awaited him. "Seraphine?" he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. For a moment, there was no response. Only the gentle rustle of wind moving through overgrown grass and the distant call of birds somewhere in the surrounding trees. Then, from somewhere beyond the main building, perhaps from a garden hidden behind the structure, he heard the sound of footsteps, quick and light, moving toward him. He turned toward the sound, and there, rounding the corner of the old manor, dressed simply in a plain gray dress, with her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands from garden work, stood his wife. She stopped abruptly when she saw him, her eyes widening with surprise, though not, he was relieved to notice, with anger or fear. "Alaric," she said softly, her voice carrying across the distance between them, "you came." "Of course I came," he replied, taking a step toward her, though he stopped himself, uncertain whether she wanted him closer or whether she needed more distance and time. "I read your letter. I read the letters in the tower as well. All of them. I know what my father did to your family." Seraphine's expression shifted, something complicated moving across her features, relief mixed with lingering hurt, hope mixed with caution. "And what do you feel, now that you know?" Alaric considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give her the honest response she deserved rather than something quick and easy. "I feel angry," he said slowly. "Angry at a man I can no longer question, a man I thought I understood, but clearly did not fully know. I feel sorrow for what your family suffered, for everything that was taken from them, from you, before you were even born, to inherit the consequences of his actions. And I feel afraid, Seraphine, afraid that this terrible history might stand between us, in a way that neither of us can overcome, no matter how much we might wish otherwise." Seraphine walked closer, though she stopped a few steps away, close enough to speak without raising her voice, but not so close as to eliminate the space between them entirely. "I have felt many of the same things these past weeks," she admitted. "Anger, sorrow, fear. But I have also felt something else, something I did not expect to feel when I first discovered those letters." "What is that?" Alaric asked. "Clarity," she said. "Being here, in this place my family once called home, working to bring even a small piece of it back to life, has helped me understand something important. The wrong that was done to my family happened generations ago, carried out by people who are no longer living to answer for their choices. You did not create this history, Alaric, and you cannot undo it simply by wishing it were different. But you can choose how you respond to it, now that you know the truth. That choice, I have come to believe, matters more than the sins of those who came before us." Alaric felt a small measure of hope stirring in his chest, though he remained cautious, not wanting to assume too much too quickly. "What choice do you believe I should make?" Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read something deeper than his words alone could convey. "I do not know yet, exactly. But I know that I have spent these past weeks here, working to restore even a small corner of what was lost, and I have found a strange sort of peace in it. Perhaps that peace could grow into something larger, if you are willing to help me build it, rather than simply apologizing for something you did not do, and then returning to a life that pretends none of this ever happened." "I am willing," Alaric said immediately, the words coming from somewhere deep and certain within him. "I do not know exactly what that means yet, practically speaking, but I am willing to learn, and I am willing to spend whatever time is necessary, making things right, as much as such things can be made right, after so many years." A small, cautious smile finally appeared on Seraphine's face, the first true smile Alaric had seen since arriving. "Then perhaps you should see what I have been doing here these past weeks, and perhaps, together, we can decide what comes next." She turned and began walking toward the garden behind the manor, and Alaric followed her, his heart still uncertain, but filled with a fragile, growing hope that perhaps, despite everything, they might yet find a way forward together. The garden behind the manor was smaller than Alaric expected, tucked between two crumbling stone walls that had once marked the boundary of a much grander space. Seraphine had cleared perhaps a quarter of it, pulling weeds and dead growth away to reveal old stone paths beneath, and planting simple flowers along the borders where sunlight reached most easily. It was modest work, the kind of labor that would take months, perhaps years, to fully restore, but it carried a quiet dignity that Alaric found himself admiring more than he expected. "I found something else," Seraphine said, kneeling beside a small patch of overturned earth near the garden's center, Something I have not yet mentioned in any letter, because I only discovered it a few days ago, and I have been trying to understand what it means before deciding what to do with it. Alaric knelt beside her, curious and slightly uneasy. What did you find? She reached into a small satchel resting near the flower bed and withdrew a thin, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age but still largely intact. This belonged to my great-grandmother, I believe, based on the dates within it. I found it buried beneath a loose stone near the old cellar entrance, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from the damp. She must have hidden it deliberately, perhaps fearing that whatever she wrote might be discovered and destroyed if left in plain sight. What does it say? Seraphine opened the journal carefully, to a page she had marked with a thin ribbon. Most of it describes ordinary matters, daily life, the running of the household, small joys, and small worries. But toward the end, she writes about the final months before her family lost everything, and she mentions a name I did not expect to find. She turned the journal toward him, pointing to a passage written in careful, flowing script. Alaric read the words slowly, his understanding of the events growing more complicated with every line. The old Duke did not act alone in this, the passage read. My husband believes, though he cannot prove it, that a man named Edwin Voss, a distant relation of the Whitmore family who managed certain trade agreements on their behalf, played an equal part in our ruin. It was Voss who first suggested the boundary dispute to the Duke, and it was Voss who profited most directly from the trade routes that passed through our former lands once they changed hands. My husband believes Voss saw an opportunity and pushed the Duke toward it, knowing the Duke's pride would make him receptive to any suggestion that increased his family's holdings and reputation. Alaric looked up from the journal, his expression troubled. Edwin Voss. I do not recognize the name from any records I have seen, but if this is accurate, it suggests my father was not solely responsible, or at least, not the only one who benefited. That is what concerns me, Seraphine said. If Voss's descendants still exist, and if they still benefit from arrangements made through this scheme, they may have reason to want this history to remain buried. My family's ruin secured wealth and position, not only for the Whitmore line, but perhaps for another family as well, one that has remained hidden from public knowledge all this time. Alaric sat back on his heels, considering the implications carefully. If such a family exists, and still profits from what was done to yours, they would have strong reason to oppose any effort to restore your name or reputation, let alone any attempt to reclaim what was lost. This could become more complicated than either of us anticipated. I have already begun trying to trace the name, Seraphine admitted. I sent a careful inquiry to an old family friend, who serves as a clerk in the regional records office, asking him to search for any mention of Voss in connection with trade agreements along the eastern routes. I have not yet received his response, but I expect it may arrive within the week. Alaric felt a mixture of admiration and concern at her resourcefulness. You have been busy these past weeks, far busier than I imagined when I first found your letter. I could not simply wait idly for you to return, she said, a faint smile touching her lips, despite the seriousness of their conversation. I needed to understand fully what had happened, not only for my own peace of mind, but because I suspected, correctly it seems, that the full truth involved more than a single man's ambition. They spent the remainder of the afternoon walking through the old manor together, Seraphine pointing out sections she hoped to eventually restore, describing what she remembered from the single childhood visit she had made here many years earlier, before her family's full history had been explained to her in the sanitized, incomplete version she had grown up believing. Alaric listened carefully, offering suggestions where he could, though he found himself increasingly focused, not on the physical restoration of the building, but on the deeper question of what justice, if any, could still be sought for the wrong done to her family so many years ago. As evening approached, they settled in what had once been a modest sitting room, now cleared of debris and furnished simply with a small table and 2 chairs that Seraphine had apparently brought from somewhere nearby, along with a small fire she lit in the room's stone hearth to ward off the evening chill. They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit from Alaric's provisions, and for a while, the conversation between them turned away from the difficult history and toward smaller, gentler matters, memories of their courtship, small stories about people they both knew, the kind of easy conversation that reminded Alaric why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. But as the fire crackled and the evening deepened into full darkness outside, Seraphine's expression grew serious again, and she set down the piece of bread she had been eating. folding her hands carefully in her lap. "Alaric, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, no matter how difficult the answer might be." "Of course," he said, setting aside his own meal, giving her his full attention. "If it turns out that pursuing justice for my family, fully and publicly, would damage the Whitmore name, would cost your family standing, wealth, perhaps even the title itself, would you still wish to pursue it? Or would you prefer we simply understand the truth privately, between the two of us, and allow the world to continue believing whatever story it has always believed?" Alaric considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that his answer would shape not only their marriage, but potentially the futures of both their families. "I became Duke because my father held that title before me, and I have always tried to act with honor in that role, even before I knew the truth of how our family's fortune expanded during his time. Now that I know, I do not believe I can simply continue benefiting from a wrong that was never corrected, hiding behind the comfort of not wanting to disturb old arrangements. If pursuing justice for your family cost the Whitmore name some measure of its current standing, then perhaps that standing was never fully deserved in the first place. I would rather hold a smaller title honestly than a grander one built upon a foundation I know to be corrupt." Seraphine's eyes filled with tears at his answer, though she quickly wiped them away, composing herself.
"I did not expect you to answer so completely, so quickly. I feared, perhaps unfairly, that you might hesitate, that the weight of your position might make such honesty difficult."
"I will not pretend the thought does not frighten me," Alaric admitted. "Everything I have known, the castle, the title, the responsibilities I have carried since my father's passing, all of it could change if we pursue this fully. But I would rather face that uncertainty honestly, beside you, than continue living comfortably atop a truth I now cannot unknow." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire slowly burning down to glowing embers, the darkness outside deepening further as the night wore on. Eventually, Seraphine rose and moved to a small chest near the corner of the room, retrieving a folded piece of paper she had apparently kept separate from the journal she had shown him earlier. "There is one more thing I must show you," she said, returning to her seat and unfolding the paper carefully. "This arrived only 2 days ago, carried by a messenger from the Regional Records Office. It is the response from my friend, the clerk, regarding the name Edwin Voss." Alaric leaned forward, his curiosity mixing with a growing sense of unease. "What does it say?" Seraphine's expression grew grave as she began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the evident weight of the words she spoke. "My dear friend, I have searched the records as you requested, and I have found troubling information that I believe you should know without delay. The name Edwin Voss does indeed appear connected to trade agreements along the eastern routes during the period you inquired about, and more concerning still, the Voss family line has continued to benefit from those same agreements to this very day. The current head of that family, a man named Corwin Voss, holds significant influence over trade along the eastern border, and maintains close ties to several powerful figures within the regional court. I must caution you, dear friend, that any inquiry into this matter may attract unwanted attention, as Corwin Voss is known to protect his family's interests with considerable determination, and not always through entirely lawful means. Please proceed with great caution, and consider carefully before pursuing this further." Alaric felt a cold weight settle in his chest as Seraphine finished reading. "Corwin Voss," he repeated slowly. "A man with influence at court, and apparently a willingness to protect his interests, by whatever means necessary." "Yes," Seraphine said quietly. "And if he learns that we are investigating the true history of my family's ruin, and his own family's role in it, I fear he will not simply allow us to proceed without consequence." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old, broken shutters of the manor, and sending a low, mournful sound echoing through the abandoned halls. Alaric looked toward the darkened window, an uneasy feeling settling over him that their search for truth and justice might soon become far more dangerous than either of them had initially anticipated. Smoke woke Alaric before any sound did. He opened his eyes to a thin gray haze drifting across the ceiling of the small room, where he had fallen asleep in a chair beside the dying fire, and for a moment, his mind refused to accept what his senses were telling him. Then he heard Seraphine's voice, sharp with alarm, calling his name from somewhere deeper in the manor. "Alaric!" "The old storage room. It's burning." He was on his feet instantly, all traces of sleep gone in a single heartbeat. He grabbed the nearest cloth, dipped it quickly into the small basin of water they had used for washing, and pressed it over his mouth and nose as he ran toward the sound of her voice, following the growing haze of smoke through the dark corridor. He found her at the entrance to a small room near the back of the manor, one of the areas she had not yet cleared of old debris, and flames were already climbing along a pile of dry, broken furniture stacked against the far wall, the fire spreading with alarming speed through material that had sat untouched and dry for years. "The letters," Seraphine gasped, her eyes wide with fear, not for herself, but for what the fire threatened to destroy. "The journal, and the box of letters, they are still in the sitting room, but if this spreads through the corridor before we can stop it, get them now," Alaric said firmly, already moving toward the burning room, grabbing a nearby length of old curtain to smother what flames he could reach. "I will try to slow this. Go, quickly." Seraphine did not argue. She turned and ran back through the corridor, while Alaric worked desperately to contain the fire, beating at the flames with the heavy curtain, his eyes stinging from smoke, his lungs burning with each breath he drew through the damp cloth over his face. The fire resisted his efforts at first, flaring higher as it consumed the dry wood. But gradually, with persistent effort, he managed to smother enough of it to slow its spread toward the corridor, buying precious time. He heard Seraphine's footsteps returning moments later, and she appeared beside him, the leather journal and the wooden box of letters clutched tightly against her chest, safe from the flames. "We need water," she said urgently. "There is an old well just outside the kitchen entrance, though I do not know if the mechanism still works properly." "Show me," Alaric said, and together they ran through the smoke-filled corridor toward the kitchen, emerging into the cool night air with relief as they left the worst of the smoke behind them. The old well stood exactly where Seraphine remembered, its stone structure weathered but intact, and Alaric worked quickly to lower the attached bucket, praying silently that the rope and pulley had not rotted beyond use. To his relief, the mechanism held, and he drew up bucket after bucket of cold water, passing them to Seraphine, who carried them back into the manor and threw them onto the spreading flames with fierce determination. They worked together for what felt like an eternity, though it could not have been more than half an hour, their movements growing increasingly desperate as the fire fought to spread despite their efforts. Finally, gradually, the flames began to weaken, the fresh water overcoming what remained of the dry fuel, until only smoldering embers and thick smoke remained where the fire had raged only minutes before. Alaric leaned against the doorframe, exhausted, his hands blackened with soot, his lungs still aching from the smoke he had breathed. Beside him, Seraphine sank to the floor, equally spent, the empty bucket still clutched in her trembling hands. "We stopped it," she said quietly, disbelief evident in her voice. "We actually stopped it." "For now," Alaric said, his voice hoarse. He looked around at the damage, the blackened walls, the ruined furniture that had fed the flames, and a cold thought settled over him that he had been trying to avoid since the moment he first smelled smoke. Seraphine, this room held nothing but old, dry debris. There was no fire lit here tonight, no candle left burning carelessly. How did this begin? Seraphine looked up at him, her expression shifting from exhaustion to sudden, sharp alarm as she understood the implication of his question. "You believe someone set this fire deliberately?" "I do not want to believe it," Alaric said carefully, "but I cannot think of another explanation. We were the only two people here, and neither of us lit any fire in that room. If it was not an accident, then someone else was here tonight, someone who wanted this manor, and perhaps everything within it, to burn." They searched the grounds carefully once they had recovered enough strength to move, circling the manor with a lantern Seraphine retrieved from her small stock of supplies, looking for any sign of an intruder. Near the rear wall of the garden, close to where the burning room's single window faced outward, they found what they had feared they might find: a patch of grass, trampled recently by careful footsteps, and beside it, half hidden beneath a bush, a small, empty glass container that smelled unmistakably of oil, the kind used to help fire catch and spread quickly through dry material. "Someone came here tonight," Alaric said grimly, holding the container up to the lantern light. "Someone who knew exactly how to start a fire that would spread quickly through a room full of old, dry debris, and who fled once the fire had properly taken hold." Seraphine's face had gone pale, though her voice remained steady. "Corwin Voss. It must be connected to him. We only sent the inquiry a matter of days ago, and already someone has come here to destroy evidence, perhaps even to harm us, though whoever set this fire clearly did not expect us to be sleeping in a different part of the manor, or did not realize how quickly we would discover the flames. We cannot stay here any longer, Alaric said firmly, his earlier exhaustion replaced now by sharp, urgent alertness. If Voss is willing to send someone to burn evidence, he may be willing to attempt something far more dangerous once he learns his first attempt failed. We need to move the letters and the journal somewhere safer, and we need to consider carefully who we can trust with what we now know. Seraphine nodded, clutching the journal and the box of letters more tightly against her chest. Where do you suggest we go? Whitmore Castle stands empty of staff, easily approached by anyone who wishes us harm, and returning here after tonight seems equally unwise. Alaric thought carefully, his mind racing through the limited options available to them. There is a magistrate in the capital, a man my father once respected for his fairness, though I do not know whether he still holds his position after all these years. If we can reach him and present the evidence we carry, perhaps we can force this matter into proper legal channels before Voss finds another opportunity to silence us entirely. That is a journey of several days from here, Seraphine said, calculating the distance in her mind. And if Voss already knows we are investigating him, he may have people watching the roads, waiting to intercept us before we reach the capital. Then we will need to move carefully, and quickly, avoiding the most obvious routes, Alaric said. I know smaller paths through the countryside, less traveled roads that my father once showed me during hunting expeditions when I was young. They will add time to our journey, but they may also help us avoid detection. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, and despite the danger surrounding them, despite the exhaustion and fear evident in her eyes, Alaric saw something else there as well. A renewed sense of partnership, of shared purpose, that had perhaps been missing during the weeks of her solitary investigation. Then let us prepare quickly, she said, rising to her feet with fresh determination. Whatever Voss intends, we cannot allow him to succeed. Too much has already been buried for too long. It is time the truth was finally brought into the light, whatever the cost may prove to be. They spent the remaining hours before dawn, gathering what few belongings they could carry, securing the letters and journal safely within Alaric's saddlebags, and preparing both horses for a journey that promised to be far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated when Alaric first rode east from Whitmore Castle. As the first pale light of morning began to touch the horizon, they mounted their horses and rode away from the ruined manor, leaving behind the scorched room and the unsettling proof that someone, somewhere, already knew what they were seeking and was willing to do whatever necessary to stop them from finding it. Hoofbeats echoed behind them before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, steady and fast, gaining ground with every passing minute. Alaric twisted in his saddle to look back down the narrow forest path they had chosen specifically to avoid attention, and his stomach tightened at the sight of two riders emerging from the tree line behind them, moving at a hard gallop, clearly intent on catching up rather than simply traveling the same road by chance. Riders behind us, he called to Seraphine, who rode just ahead of him on the narrow trail. They are moving too fast to be ordinary travelers. Seraphine glanced back briefly, her face tightening with the same recognition that had settled over Alaric. Voss's men, do you think? I do not know who else it could be, Alaric answered, urging his horse faster, though the narrow, uneven path made speed dangerous. We are still a full day's ride from the capital. We cannot outrun them on this road, if they truly mean to catch us. They pushed their horses harder, weaving through the trees along a path that grew increasingly rough, roots and low branches threatening to unseat them at every turn. Behind them, the hoofbeats continued to close the distance, and soon, Alaric could hear voices as well, shouted words he could not fully make out, but that carried unmistakable urgency and command. There is a narrow crossing ahead, Seraphine called back to him, her memory of the local terrain from her childhood visits apparently proving useful even now. A rope bridge over a ravine, built for foot travelers rather than horses, but I remember my father mentioning it, could be crossed carefully on foot if necessary. If we can reach it and cross while they are still searching for another way around, we might gain enough distance to lose them entirely. Lead the way, Alaric said, trusting her knowledge of this land far more than his own at this critical moment. They rode hard for several more minutes, the pursuing riders drawing steadily closer despite their best efforts, until the trail opened suddenly onto the edge of a deep, narrow ravine, its bottom lost in shadow far below, spanned by a rope bridge that looked far less sturdy than Alaric had hoped. "We cannot cross this on horseback," he said, dismounting quickly. "The horses will need to be left behind, or led very carefully. There is no time to lead them across safely," Seraphine said, already dismounting as well, her eyes scanning the bridge with rapid calculation. "We must cross on foot, quickly, and hope the horses either follow, or that we can retrieve them later. Our pursuers will be forced to do the same, which may cost them precious time if they are not prepared for it." They abandoned their mounts near the ravine's edge, grabbing only the saddlebags containing the letters and journal, and ran toward the bridge as the sound of their pursuers grew alarmingly close behind them. Alaric stepped onto the rope bridge first, testing its stability with cautious steps, feeling it sway unsteadily beneath his weight, the wooden planks worn and gapped in places where age had claimed sections of the original structure. "Follow closely behind me," he called back to Seraphine, "and keep your weight centered. Do not look down." They moved across the swaying bridge as quickly as caution allowed, the ravine yawning dangerously beneath them, the sound of rushing water far below barely audible over the pounding of Alaric's own heartbeat. Halfway across, he heard shouts from behind them, and glancing back briefly, he saw their two pursuers arriving at the ravine's edge, dismounting hastily, and beginning to follow onto the bridge themselves. "They are following," Seraphine said, her voice tight with fear, but steady with determination. "Alaric, we must move faster." He pushed forward, testing each plank before committing his full weight, moving as quickly as the treacherous crossing allowed. Behind them, the bridge swayed more violently, as their pursuers added their weight to its structure, and Alaric felt a fresh surge of urgency, knowing that the old ropes were never meant to bear the combined weight of 4 grown adults at once. They reached the far side just as a sharp cracking sound echoed from somewhere behind them, one of the support ropes finally giving way under the accumulated strain. Alaric grabbed Seraphine's arm and pulled her the final few steps onto solid ground as the bridge lurched dangerously, one entire section dropping several feet before catching on its remaining supports. Behind them, their pursuers scrambled backward in alarm, one of them nearly losing his footing entirely as the damaged bridge swayed wildly beneath him. "The bridge cannot hold much more weight," Alaric said, breathing hard from the exertion and the fear that had driven them across. "They will not be able to follow us this way, not without significant risk." Indeed, watching from the far side, they saw their pursuers hesitate at the ravine's edge, clearly recognizing the danger the damaged bridge now posed. After a tense moment of shouted conversation between the two men that Alaric could not clearly hear, the pursuers turned back, apparently deciding the risk was too great, or perhaps planning to search for another crossing point further along the ravine. "We have gained time," Seraphine said, relief evident in her voice, though exhaustion had begun to show clearly on her face as well. "But they will find another way across eventually, and they know now which direction we are traveling." "Then we must use this time wisely," Alaric said, already scanning the landscape ahead of them for the quickest path toward the capital. "We have lost our horses, which will slow us considerably, but perhaps we can find a village nearby, where we might purchase or borrow fresh mounts, and continue our journey before Voss's men manage to circle around and catch up with us again." They walked for the better part of an hour, moving as quickly as their tired legs allowed, before finally spotting a small farming settlement nestled in a shallow valley ahead of them, smoke rising from several chimneys in the cool morning air. Alaric approached the nearest farmhouse cautiously, and after a brief conversation with the farmer, a weathered but kind man who recognized the Whitmore name with evident respect, they were able to arrange for 2 sturdy farm horses, along with a promise of generous payment once Alaric could properly settle accounts from the capital. As they rode away from the small settlement on their new mounts, pushing toward the capital with renewed urgency, Alaric found himself glancing back frequently along the road behind them, watching for any sign that Voss's men had found a way to resume their pursuit. Beside him, Seraphine rode with quiet determination, her earlier exhaustion apparently pushed aside by the same urgent need that drove them both forward. "We must reach the magistrate before Voss anticipates our next move," she said, breaking the tense silence between them. "If he already knows we survived the fire and evaded his men at the ravine, he will not simply wait patiently for us to arrive in the capital unopposed. He will move to protect himself further, perhaps by reaching the magistrate first, with some story designed to discredit us, before we can present our evidence. Then we ride through the night if necessary, Alaric said firmly. We cannot afford to lose any more time than we already have. They pushed their horses hard, through the remaining hours of daylight, and into the early evening, stopping only briefly to rest the animals and share a quick meal from their remaining provisions, before continuing onward, beneath a sky, slowly filling with stars. The road ahead remained uncertain, the danger behind them far from fully resolved, but with every mile that passed beneath their horses' hooves, Alaric felt a growing conviction that they would reach the capital, that they would find the justice Seraphine's family had been denied for so many years, and that whatever cost this pursuit of truth might ultimately demand, it was a price worth paying for the sake of honesty, and for the sake of the love that had brought them this far together. A carriage blocked the road ahead of them, just as the outline of the capital's outer walls came into view against the pale morning sky, its dark wood polished and expensive, drawn by 4 matched black horses, positioned so precisely across the narrow route that Alaric knew immediately it had not stopped there by accident. He pulled his horse to a halt, Seraphine drawing up beside him, both of them tense with the sudden certainty that whoever waited inside that carriage had been expecting their arrival. The carriage door opened, and a tall man stepped down onto the road, dressed in fine dark clothing that spoke clearly of wealth and influence. His face was sharp-featured, his expression carrying the calm confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through careful calculation rather than open confrontation. 2 other men flanked him, standing near the carriage, with the watchful posture of hired guards rather than servants. Duke Whitmore, the man said, his voice smooth and unhurried. And the former Lady Ashfield, I presume, though I understand she now carries your family's name as well. I am Corwin Voss. I believe you have been asking questions about my family recently, questions I feel we should discuss directly, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to continue unchecked. Alaric felt Seraphine tense beside him, though her expression remained carefully controlled. You already know why we have been asking questions, Alaric said, keeping his own voice steady, despite the wariness churning inside him. Your men set fire to Ashfield Manor 2 nights past, attempting to destroy evidence of your family's involvement in the ruin of the Ashfield line generations ago. Voss's expression did not change, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, a calculation being made and remade in the span of a heartbeat. That is a serious accusation, Duke Whitmore, and one I would advise you to consider carefully before repeating publicly. I have no knowledge of any fire, nor any men acting on my behalf in such a manner. Then perhaps you can explain why 2 riders pursued us along the forest road yesterday morning, matching your family's colors on their saddles, Seraphine said sharply, unwilling to remain silent while her family's history was so casually dismissed. A brief, tense silence followed her words. Voss studied her carefully, his composure remaining outwardly intact, though Alaric noticed a slight tightening around his jaw that suggested her accusation had struck closer to truth than he wished to admit. Lady Whitmore, I understand that you have recently discovered difficult truths about your family's history, and I sympathize with the pain that must cause you, but I must caution you against making accusations you cannot fully substantiate, particularly against a family with the resources and influence to defend itself against such claims, should they become public without proper evidence. We have the evidence, Alaric said firmly. Letters written by my own father, describing in detail the scheme that stripped the Ashfield family of their land and title, and a journal from Lady Whitmore's own family, naming you specifically as a partner in that scheme, one who profited as much as my father did, perhaps more. Voss's calm expression finally cracked, just slightly, a flash of genuine alarm passing across his features before he composed himself once more. Whatever documents you believe you possess, Duke Whitmore, I would strongly advise you to consider the consequences of presenting them publicly. Reputations, once damaged, are rarely fully restored, and I do not speak only of my own family's reputation. The Whitmore name would suffer equally, perhaps more severely, should the full truth of your father's actions become widely known. Are you prepared for that consequence? Truly prepared, to see your own family's honor tarnished alongside mine? I have already considered that consequence, Alaric replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the question. I would rather see the Whitmore name diminished by an honest reckoning with the truth than continue to enjoy an honor that was never fully deserved in the first place. Voss studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating his approach now that his initial attempt at intimidation had failed to produce the desired effect. "Then perhaps we should discuss this matter differently," he said, his tone shifting toward something more conciliatory, though no less calculating. "Perhaps there is a way to address the wrongs of the past without destroying the reputations and livelihoods of the present. I could offer significant compensation to the Ashfield line, quietly, privately, without the need for public scandal or lengthy legal proceedings that would benefit no one but the lawyers involved." "You are offering to buy our silence," Seraphine said, her voice cold with understanding. "You wish to pay us quietly so that your family's role in destroying mine remains hidden, allowing you to continue benefiting from arrangements built upon that same destruction." "I am offering a practical solution," Voss countered, though the accusation clearly stung him. "One that acknowledges past wrongs without requiring the messy, public spectacle of court proceedings that could take years and produce uncertain results, even with the evidence you claim to possess." Alaric looked at Seraphine, silently asking whether she wished to respond, or whether she preferred he speak on their shared behalf. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and he turned back to Voss with a firm resolve that had only grown stronger throughout their difficult journey. "We do not want your money, Mr. Voss. We want the truth acknowledged properly, through legal channels, so that the Ashfield name can be restored with the dignity it was denied for so many years. We want a magistrate to review the evidence we carry, and determine what justice, if any, can still be provided after so much time has passed. We do not seek your ruin specifically, but we will not allow you to bury this history simply because acknowledging it proves inconvenient to your family's continued prosperity." Voss's face hardened, the conciliatory mask slipping away entirely now. "You understand, Duke Whitmore, that I will not simply allow this matter to proceed unopposed. I have considerable influence within the capital, connections that extend to the very court you intend to approach. Your evidence, however compelling you believe it to be, may find a less receptive audience than you anticipate. Then we will present it honestly and let the magistrate decide," Alaric said. "If your influence proves strong enough to prevent justice from being served, that will simply confirm the very corruption we already suspect runs through this entire affair. But I do not believe every person of authority in this capital can be so easily swayed, and I am willing to risk that uncertainty, rather than accept a quiet payment that changes nothing of substance." Voss stared at them both for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing his remaining options. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stepped back toward his carriage. "Very well. If you insist on pursuing this matter through formal channels, I will not stand in your way further, though I caution you both to consider carefully what you truly hope to gain from stirring up history, best left settled. Not every truth serves justice, Duke Whitmore. Some truths merely serve to satisfy old grievances at the cost of present stability." "We will take that risk," Seraphine said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that had grown steadily throughout their difficult conversation. Voss climbed back into his carriage without further response, and his driver guided the vehicle off the narrow road, clearing the path forward. As the carriage pulled away, Alaric noticed Voss watching them through the small window, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes suggested this confrontation was far from finished, regardless of what he had claimed about not standing in their way. "He will not simply let this matter rest," Alaric said quietly, once the carriage had disappeared around a distant bend in the road. "Whatever he claims, I suspect he intends to reach the capital ahead of us, or to use whatever influence he possesses to complicate our presentation of evidence. Then we must move quickly, and we must be prepared for whatever obstacles he places in our path," Seraphine replied, urging her horse forward once more. "We have come too far, and survived too much already, to allow him to stop us now." They rode on toward the capital with renewed urgency, the confrontation with Voss having confirmed everything they feared, while also strengthening their shared determination to see this difficult journey through to its proper conclusion, whatever challenges still awaited them within the walls of the city ahead. The magistrate's office stood locked and dark when they finally reached it late that evening, exhausted from the long ride and the tension of their earlier confrontation. A young clerk, preparing to leave for the night, informed them with obvious regret that the magistrate, a man named Aldrich Fenwick, had already departed for his private residence and would not return to the office until the following morning at the earliest. Is there any way we might reach him tonight? Alaric asked, unable to hide the urgency in his voice. The matter we bring is time-sensitive, and I fear delay may allow certain parties to interfere before we can present our evidence properly. The clerk hesitated, clearly weighing the propriety of disturbing the magistrate outside normal hours against the evident seriousness of the Duke's request. Magistrate Fenwick does not typically receive visitors at his home, my lord, especially not without prior arrangement. However, given your position and the urgency you describe, I could send a messenger to inform him of your request, and perhaps he would be willing to make an exception. Please do so, Seraphine said, before Alaric could respond, her own exhaustion evident, but her determination unwavering. Tell him that Duke Whitmore and Lady Seraphine Ashfield Whitmore request an urgent audience regarding evidence of a decades-old injustice that requires immediate legal attention before certain parties can obstruct the proper administration of justice. The clerk nodded and hurried off to send the message, leaving Alaric and Seraphine to wait anxiously in the small outer office, both of them acutely aware that every passing minute gave Voss additional opportunity to exert whatever influence he possessed to delay or discredit their efforts. The wait stretched agonizingly long, nearly 2 hours passing before the clerk returned, accompanied this time by an older man, dressed in simple but well-made clothing, his face lined with the weight of years spent weighing difficult legal matters, his eyes sharp and assessing as he studied the two exhausted travelers before him. Duke Whitmore, the man said, extending a formal greeting despite the late hour. I am Magistrate Fenwick. My clerk informs me you bring a matter of considerable urgency. I confess, I was reluctant to receive visitors at this hour, but your family name carries sufficient weight that I felt obligated to at least hear what brings you to my door so late in the evening. Thank you for seeing us, Magistrate, Alaric said, relief evident in his voice, despite his continued exhaustion. What we bring concerns a grave injustice committed decades ago, one that has only recently come to light, and one that certain powerful individuals appear determined to keep buried before proper justice can be sought. He proceeded to explain the situation carefully, describing the letters discovered in the Whitmore family archives, the journal found at Ashfield Manor, and the confrontation with Corwin Voss earlier that very day. Seraphine added her own account where relevant, describing her discovery of the truth and her subsequent journey to understand its full implications. The magistrate listened carefully throughout, his expression giving little away, though Alaric noticed his attention sharpen considerably when Voss's name was mentioned in connection with the scheme. You understand, Fenwick said once they had finished their account, that Corwin Voss holds considerable influence within this capital. Several members of the regional court owe him favors, financial and otherwise, and he has cultivated relationships with individuals whose support could prove valuable in any proceeding you might bring against him. This will not be a simple matter to pursue, even with the evidence you describe. We understand the difficulty, Seraphine said, but we also believe that difficulty does not justify abandoning the pursuit of justice, particularly when the evidence is as clear as what we carry. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, perhaps recognizing genuine conviction, rather than mere anger or personal ambition. May I see this evidence you speak of? Alaric retrieved the letters and the journal from his saddlebags, carefully unwrapping them and presenting them to the magistrate, who examined each document with the careful, practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating legal proof. He read slowly, occasionally pausing to reread certain passages, his expression growing increasingly grave as he progressed through the material. This is significant, he finally said, setting the documents down carefully on his desk. The letters from your father, Duke Whitmore, are damning in their clarity, describing precisely the kind of legal manipulation and bribery that would constitute serious criminal conduct, regardless of how many years have passed since the events occurred. And this journal, describing Voss's direct involvement, corroborates the account in a manner that would be difficult for any reasonable court to dismiss entirely. Then you believe we have grounds to pursue this matter formally? Alaric asked, hope stirring cautiously in his chest for the first time since their difficult journey began. I believe you have grounds to bring this before the regional court, Fenwick said carefully. Whether that court will rule in your favor is a separate question entirely, particularly given Voss's influence and the political complexities involved in reversing decisions made so many years ago. But you have sufficient evidence to at least force a proper hearing, which is more than many who bring similar grievances can claim. What must we do next? Seraphine asked. I will need to formally review this evidence and prepare the necessary documentation to bring this matter before the court, Fenwick explained. This will take several days at minimum, perhaps longer, given the complexity involved. I would advise you both to remain in the capital during this time, available should the court require additional testimony or clarification, and I would strongly advise discretion. If Voss learns the precise nature and strength of the evidence you carry, he may attempt to interfere with witnesses, records, or the proceedings themselves before we can bring this matter to proper resolution. He already attempted to destroy evidence once, through fire, Alaric said grimly. I do not doubt he would attempt something similar again, if given the opportunity. Fenwick nodded gravely. Then I will take particular care to secure these documents properly, in a location known only to myself and the necessary court officials, until the matter can be formally presented. I would also suggest, Duke Whitmore, that you consider your own safety, and that of Lady Whitmore, carefully during the coming days. A man willing to burn evidence to protect his interests may prove willing to take more direct action if he believes formal proceedings threaten him significantly. The warning settled uncomfortably over both of them, though neither voiced the fear it stirred. They thanked the magistrate for his time and his willingness to consider their evidence seriously, and after arranging to return to his office the following morning to begin the formal proceedings, they made their way to a modest inn recommended by the clerk, exhausted but cautiously hopeful for the first time since their journey had begun. That night, as they finally settled into a small but clean room, the weight of everything that had happened over the past several days seemed to catch up with them both at once. Seraphine sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her earlier composure finally giving way to quiet tears, the accumulated stress of discovering her family's tragic history, dismantling her own household, confronting fire and pursuit, and now placing their fate in the hands of a legal system that might or might not deliver true justice, all of it settling heavily upon her at once. Alaric sat beside her, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders, offering what comfort he could without words, understanding that sometimes silence and simple presence spoke more clearly than anything he might say. They sat together for a long while in the quiet room, two people bound together by love, by shared purpose, and now by a difficult truth that neither of them could have anticipated when Alaric first rode home to find his castle standing empty. Whatever happens with the court, Seraphine finally said, her voice quiet but steady. I am glad you came after me. I am glad we faced this together, rather than each of us carrying it alone. I would not have had it any other way, Alaric replied softly. Whatever the court decides, we have already proven something important these past days, that we can face difficult truths honestly, together, without allowing fear or old wrongs to drive us apart. Whatever comes next, I believe we will face it the same way. Outside their small window, the lights of the capital flickered in the darkness, and somewhere within that same city, Corwin Voss was undoubtedly already working to protect his interests by whatever means he could muster. But for the moment, exhausted and finally safe within the walls of the capital, Alaric and Seraphine allowed themselves a brief measure of peace, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but trusting, cautiously, that the truth they carried was strong enough to withstand whatever opposition still awaited them. A commotion outside the courtroom doors reached them before the proceedings had even properly begun, raised voices and the sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the stone corridor, where Alaric and Seraphine waited alongside Magistrate Fenwick, preparing to enter the formal hearing that had been arranged after 3 tense days of preparation. Fenwick's expression tightened with concern as he moved quickly toward the source of the disturbance, gesturing for Alaric and Seraphine to remain where they stood. He returned moments later, his face grave. Voss has arrived with his own legal counsel, along with 3 witnesses he claims will testify that the letters and journal you presented are forgeries, crafted recently for the purpose of extortion. He is attempting to have the hearing dismissed before it can properly begin, on the grounds that the evidence itself is fraudulent. That is absurd, Seraphine said sharply. Anyone examining those documents properly would recognize their age, the aging of the parchment, the fading of the ink. Such details cannot be easily forged. I agree, Fenwick said. But Voss is clearly prepared for this possibility, and his witnesses may attempt to cast sufficient doubt to delay or dismiss the proceedings, particularly if the presiding judge is inclined to favor his considerable influence over the strength of the physical evidence alone. "Who is the presiding judge?" Alaric asked. "Judge Callahan," Fenwick replied. "A fair man, in my experience, though not immune to the pressures that come with a case involving someone as influential as Corwin Voss. We must present our evidence clearly and confidently, and hope that the judge's commitment to proper justice outweighs whatever pressure Voss attempts to apply." They entered the courtroom together, and Alaric felt Seraphine's hand find his own, gripping tightly as they took their seats before the raised bench where Judge Callahan sat, an older man with a stern but not unkind face, flanked by two clerks recording the proceedings. Across the room, Corwin Voss sat with three men Alaric did not recognize, along with a sharply dressed legal counsel who watched the proceedings with the confident air of a man accustomed to winning difficult cases. The hearing began with Magistrate Fenwick presenting the evidence formally, describing the letters discovered in the Whitmore archives and the journal found at Ashfield Manor, along with the circumstances of their discovery and the subsequent fire that had threatened to destroy them entirely. Judge Callahan listened carefully, examining the documents himself when they were presented, his expression thoughtful and difficult to read. When Fenwick finished his presentation, Voss's legal counsel rose immediately, requesting permission to call his witnesses, who proceeded to testify, one after another, that they possessed expert knowledge of document authentication, and that, in their professional opinion, the letters and journal showed signs of recent creation, designed to mimic older documents, rather than genuine artifacts from decades past. Alaric felt his stomach tighten with each testimony, watching Judge Callahan's expression carefully for any indication of how he was receiving these claims. But when it came time for cross-examination, Fenwick rose with calm confidence, and Alaric began to understand why the magistrate had been so highly regarded within these halls. "You claim expertise in document authentication," Fenwick said to the first witness, a thin man with nervous eyes, who had testified most confidently against the evidence. "Can you tell the court where you received your training in this particular field?" The witness hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. "I have worked with documents for many years, in my capacity as a merchant, dealing in rare books and papers." "A merchant," Fenwick repeated, "not a scholar trained specifically in the examination of aged parchment and ink composition. And can you tell the court how you came to be selected as a witness in this particular proceeding?" Another uncomfortable pause followed. "I was approached by representatives of Mr. Voss, who explained the nature of the case and asked if I would be willing to examine the documents in question." "And were you compensated for your testimony today?" The witness's eyes flickered briefly toward Voss before answering. "I received payment for my time and expertise, as is customary for such consultations." Fenwick turned to address Judge Callahan directly. "Your Honor, I would respectfully suggest that a witness selected and compensated directly by the opposing party, lacking formal scholarly training in document authentication, provides testimony of questionable reliability, compared to an independent examination by a qualified expert, with no financial interest in the outcome of these proceedings." Judge Callahan nodded slowly, making a note before turning his attention back to the courtroom. "I am inclined to agree with Magistrate Fenwick's assessment. Before this court reaches any conclusion regarding the authenticity of the presented documents, I will order an independent examination by a scholar of the university archives, someone with no connection to either party in this dispute, whose findings will carry considerably more weight than testimony purchased for the specific purpose of casting doubt." A visible tension rippled through the courtroom at these words, and Alaric saw Voss's composed expression finally crack with genuine alarm, understanding that his attempt to have the evidence dismissed outright had failed to achieve its intended effect. The independent scholar, a quiet, precise woman named Miriam Ashcroft, who arrived within the hour from the university archives located nearby, examined the documents with careful, methodical attention, using small instruments Alaric did not recognize, to study the composition of the ink and the aging patterns of the parchment itself. After nearly an hour of careful examination, she addressed the court with quiet, confident authority. "Your Honor, based on my examination, I can state with considerable confidence that these documents are genuine artifacts, consistent with the age claimed by the parties presenting them. The ink composition matches known formulations from several decades past, no longer commonly used in more recent document creation. The parchment shows natural aging consistent with proper storage over an extended period. rather than artificial aging techniques that would leave detectable inconsistencies under careful examination. In my professional opinion, these documents are authentic. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence following her testimony, and Alaric watched as Voss's expression shifted from alarm to something approaching desperation. His earlier confidence entirely drained away. Judge Callahan turned toward him directly, his expression now considerably less patient than it had been at the hearing's beginning. Mr. Voss, given the independent confirmation of these documents' authenticity, I must ask whether you wish to address the substance of the claims presented against your family, rather than continuing to challenge the evidence itself. Voss rose slowly, his composure visibly strained. Your Honor, whatever occurred decades ago involved actions taken by my ancestor, not by myself. I fail to see how I can be held responsible for choices made before my own birth. That may be a fair point regarding personal criminal responsibility, Judge Callahan replied evenly, but this court must also consider the matter of continued benefit derived from those historical wrongs, and whether restitution is owed to the Ashfield family regardless of who specifically committed the original offense. Furthermore, the recent attempts to destroy evidence and intimidate the parties bringing this claim forward suggest a continued effort to obstruct justice that occurred well within your own lifetime and under your own direction, which this court takes very seriously indeed. Voss said nothing further, sinking back into his seat with the visible weight of a man who understood that his careful efforts to protect his family's interests had ultimately failed. Judge Callahan turned his attention back to Alaric and Seraphine, his expression softening slightly as he addressed them directly. Duke Whitmore, Lady Whitmore, this court finds the evidence you have presented compelling and authentic. I intend to order a full review of the original land transfers and title changes that strip the Ashfield family of their holdings, with the goal of determining appropriate restitution, whether through the return of land, financial compensation, or the formal restoration of title and reputation, or some combination of all three. This process will take time to complete properly, but I assure you both that this court takes seriously its obligation to correct historical injustices when compelling evidence, properly authenticated, demonstrates that such injustices occurred. Relief flooded through Alaric so powerfully that he felt momentarily unsteady, and beside him, Seraphine's hand tightened around his own, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, though these were tears of relief and vindication rather than fear or grief. After everything they had endured together, the fire, the pursuit, the dangerous confrontation on the road, the exhausting preparation for this very hearing, justice finally seemed within reach, not fully realized yet, but no longer merely a distant hope. As the courtroom began to empty following the judge's ruling, Alaric turned to Seraphine, both of them still absorbing the significance of what had just occurred. We did it, he said softly, disbelief and joy mingling in his voice. We actually did it. We did it together, Seraphine corrected gently, her tear-streaked face breaking into the first genuine, unguarded smile Alaric had seen from her since he first found her letter on his pillow so many days ago. Whatever comes next, whatever the court ultimately decides regarding restitution, we have already achieved something far more important. We have proven that truth can withstand even the most determined efforts to bury it, and that love, real love, can survive even the most difficult history, if two people are willing to face it honestly, together. Months passed before the court finalized its full ruling, months filled with careful legal proceedings, additional testimony, and detailed review of old land records that had once seemed lost to history entirely. When the final judgment came, delivered formally by Judge Callahan in a quiet ceremony, attended only by those directly involved, it exceeded almost everything Alaric and Seraphine had dared to hope for at the outset of their difficult journey. The Ashfield name was formally restored, along with a significant portion of the original land that had been taken so many years before, much of it reclaimed from holdings that had passed, through the original scheme, into Voss family control rather than remaining with the Whitmore estate itself. Corwin Voss, stripped of considerable wealth and standing as a result of the ruling, along with the public exposure of his family's role in the original injustice, retreated from public life entirely, his influence within the capital diminished beyond recovery. Alaric felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet sense that a long-overdue balance had finally been restored. The Whitmore name, as Alaric had anticipated, did suffer some measure of damage once the full details of his father's actions became publicly known. Several old allies distanced themselves. Whispers followed him through gatherings he had once attended with easy confidence, and the weight of his father's legacy settled uncomfortably upon his shoulders, in ways he had not fully anticipated when he first chose to pursue the truth, rather than bury it. But he found, surprisingly, that he could carry this weight with far greater peace than he could have carried the alternative, a comfortable life, built upon a foundation he knew to be corrupt. Seraphine, for her part, dedicated herself with quiet passion to restoring Ashfield Manor properly, no longer working alone as she had during those first difficult weeks, but now, with the full resources and support that came with her family's restored standing. Alaric joined her often, learning alongside her the particular history of her family's land, helping oversee the careful reconstruction of buildings that had stood empty and forgotten for far too long. The garden she had begun clearing during her solitary weeks there grew steadily larger and more vibrant, spreading gradually across the grounds until it became, by the following spring, a genuine reflection of the care and determination she had first shown when she began that quiet work alone. Whitmore Castle, too, found new life. Barnaby remained as head steward, joined gradually by new staff, carefully selected to rebuild the household that had been so abruptly emptied. Alaric made certain, this time, that every member of the household understood clearly the values he intended to uphold, values built upon honesty, rather than the quiet protection of convenient lies, however uncomfortable that honesty might prove at times. On a warm afternoon, nearly a year after Alaric had first ridden through his castle's empty gates, he stood once more in that same courtyard, though everything about the scene felt different now. The stables bustled with activity, servants moved efficiently between the main hall and the kitchen, and the sound of laughter drifted from an open window where Seraphine sat with several visiting friends, sharing tea and conversation in the warm sunlight. He thought often, during quiet moments like this one, of the letter he had found on his pillow that terrible first day, the letter that had set into motion everything that followed. He had kept it carefully, tucked safely within a small box in their bedchamber, alongside the old letters from his father and the journal from Seraphine's family, preserved together as a reminder of both the darkness their families had once been capable of and the honesty and courage that had ultimately led them toward something better. Seraphine found him there in the courtyard, her friends having departed for the afternoon, and she walked toward him with the easy, comfortable grace that had returned to her movements once the long ordeal had finally concluded. "You look thoughtful," she said, slipping her arm through his. "I was remembering that first day," he admitted. "Riding through these gates, finding everything empty, discovering your letter. It feels like a lifetime ago now, though it has been barely a year." "So much has changed since then," Seraphine agreed, looking around the courtyard with quiet satisfaction. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had never found that old box in the archive tower, if I had simply continued living without ever learning the truth of what connected our two families." "I have wondered the same thing," Alaric said honestly, "but I do not believe, ultimately, that ignorance would have served either of us well. Some truths, however difficult, need to be faced eventually, and I would rather have faced this one with you, painful as parts of that journey proved to be, than continue living comfortably atop a lie neither of us fully understood." Seraphine smiled up at him, the warmth in her expression carrying none of the caution and uncertainty that had marked their reunion at Ashfield Manor so many months before. "Grateful you read the letter, and the letters in the tower, and chose to follow the difficult path rather than the easy one. Whatever challenges we faced along the way, and there were many, I would not trade the outcome for anything simpler or safer." "Nor would I," Alaric said quietly, drawing her closer as the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the courtyard they now shared together, restored and renewed, built upon a foundation of honesty rather than convenient silence. They stood together for a long while, in comfortable silence, watching the activity of their restored household move around them. Two people who had faced a terrible truth about the history connecting their families, and had chosen, ultimately, to build something better from its difficult remains. The castle that had once stood so empty and frightening, now hummed with life once more, and within its walls, and within the walls of Ashfield Manor as well, a new chapter had begun, one built not on the buried secrets of the past, but on the honest, hard-won partnership of two people who had proven, through fire and danger and difficult truth, that their love was strong enough to survive whatever history placed in its path. And so it was that the empty castle Alaric had returned to that first frightening day, became, in time, a home filled once more with warmth, laughter, and the quiet, steady presence of a love that had been tested severely and had emerged, against considerable odds, stronger and more honest than it had ever been before.